Hello everyone and welcome to the Activist Lawyer podcast. My name is Sarah Henry and I'm your host to this podcast, which offers a platform for lawyers to share their story and their journey into law and activism. Our guests will discuss the challenges and highlights of their work, as well as important cases, opinions on legal and political matters, and will offer up advice and tips for anyone interested in pursuing a career in human rights law, public interest law, or criminal justice. The Activist Lawyer podcast is brought to you by the Granite Podcast Studio. Thank you so much for listening. Today I am joined by Roi Bachmutsky, who is a human rights attorney specialising in strategic litigation against corporate actors. Roi currently serves as legal advisor and researcher on Amnesty International's Business and Human Rights team, where he manages the organisation's Corporate Crimes Project and recently authored the Corporate Crimes Handbook, which we do talk about in today's episode. Before joining Amnesty, Roi co-founded and directed the Global Echo Litigation Centre, a non-profit law firm that represents Palestinian communities in strategic litigation, seeking to hold companies accountable for complicity in violations of international law in the occupied Palestinian territory. He has also supported prosecutions of the most serious international crimes at the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court and the Commission for International Justice and Accountability. Prior to becoming a lawyer, Roi worked for the Israeli human rights organisation Breaking the Silence, and we talk about Roi's journey into law, which is fascinating, and I'm very glad that he could be with us to share his journey and also his insights into working in this area of corporate accountability on a global scale. We have touched on it before on the podcast and we spoke about specific cases as well, so I'm glad to keep this topic live and to have someone join us who has that level of expertise to take us through the kind of ins and outs of this type of work. There's also fantastic advice for anybody who wants to get into this type of work. So I would urge you, after you listen, to follow up with Roi if you're interested in this area, and also to look at the Amnesty website on corporate crimes and also the Corporate Crimes Handbook that we will share a link to in the show notes. So I really enjoyed today's conversation and I hope you do too. And as always, please review and share where possible. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of the Activist Lawyer podcast. I am delighted to be joined by Roi Bachmutsky. Roi, thank you for joining me today.
Of course, really happy to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, look, we've lots to talk about today. I'm really interested in your line of work. And as I mentioned just before we started recording there, we've touched on this a little bit with a number of our guests, but really looking at that level of corporate responsibility when it comes to human rights and conflict zones and war zones. So we're going to dive into that with you today. But firstly, I'm wondering, can we go back a little bit in time? And can you tell us how you became involved in law and in particular this type of law, this area of law that you're working in now?
Yeah, I'd be more than happy to. So maybe to give you a sense of what inspired me to be a human rights lawyer and particularly to work on corporate accountability, it would help to back up a little bit and give a bit of background. So I was born in Petah Tikva. It's a town in central Israel, not far from Tel Aviv. And actually, I was born shortly after that area was hit by a series of missiles fired by Iraq in the midst of the first Gulf War. So you could say I was thrust into armed conflict from an early age, while I was still in the womb. Yeah. And I spent my early years there and then relocated with my family to the United States at a young age for my dad's job. He was an engineer. I grew up in California, where in my school and in my community, I picked up really important values of equality and of justice. And at the time, I didn't really appreciate the tension between those ideals and the reality of the place in the country where I was born. So I only really came to appreciate that tension as an adult, which is what led me to work in human rights. Growing up in the US, I was raised with sort of a standard narrative of what was happening back home, so to speak, passed on in the American Jewish community, which portrayed Israel as a small, weak country that was constantly under threat. And that changed when I was an undergrad at UC Berkeley, which is known as an incredibly politicized campus, especially on issues of Israel and Palestine. And I remember attending an event where the Israeli human rights organization, Breaking the Silence, for anyone who doesn't know, they're made up of former soldiers who speak about either abuses that they witnessed or participated in during their military service. And hearing those testimonies about soldiers barging into kind of innocent Palestinians' homes in the middle of the night, not because they did anything wrong, but because the army wanted to create, I think they call it, a sense of being persecuted. So Palestinians living under occupation will not rise up. I mean, that shocked my conscience. It was incredibly difficult for me to deal with it. And it forced me to confront a difficult reality, which is, the place that I was born was using its powerful military to rule the daily lives of millions of Palestinians living under occupation with an iron fist. And I still remember one soldier who at that event mentioned that he had on his rifle written property of the US government or something to that effect. So I didn't know it then, but that sort of first interaction with someone who works on human rights issues was the beginning of my work in the field. And it foreshadowed also the direction I would pursue in my career. There's much more to the story, but maybe for the sake of time, I'll share that I ended up moving to Tel Aviv after college and working for Breaking the Silence. And it was there actually that I met a group of human rights lawyers that profoundly inspired me. I mean, they approached things quite differently. Instead of debating narratives, they focused on evidence and on legality. And at the time, somewhat naively, I thought maybe you don't have to persuade the public that something is morally wrong to, create a change of policy. Maybe you only need to persuade a judge that the law is being violated. I mean, if only it were that simple. I've learned since. So anyway, naivety and all, that's sort of what led me on this journey. Went on to Harvard Law School and decided to become a human rights attorney.
Wow. Gosh, that's a great journey. We'll go back again shortly just to the Israel and Palestinian context of your work. But your role now at Amnesty International in the business and human rights team, what does that involve and how did you become involved with Amnesty?
Yes, I've been working at Amnesty for over 2 years now, and the journey here was not straightforward. So, as a law student, I actually didn't think I wanted to work for one of the big human rights organizations like Amnesty or Human Rights Watch because I was still captivated by that vision of persuading a judge in a courtroom. I really wanted to be a litigator and not just any litigator. I was drawn to the criminal law. I wanted to be a prosecutor. And really not just any prosecutor, but I wanted to be an international prosecutor that held accountable those most responsible for the most serious crimes of concern to the international community. So I think that was my dream at the time. And after graduating from law school, I got a fellowship working in that field. I spent a year at the Office of the Prosecutor of the ICC. I also worked for an organization investing crimes against humanity committed by the Syrian regime. And then I was offered to stay after that year, but I decided to take another career path and start an NGO of my own. Wouldn't necessarily recommend it to everyone because human rights entrepreneurship kind of took everything I had in terms of blood, sweat, and tears. But at the time, I felt the stars were aligning, so I took that leap. So that's when I, along with two co-founders, an Israeli and Palestinian human rights lawyer, started our own nonprofit law firm known as the Global Echo Litigation Centre. And that experience really led me to Amnesty. So at the time, our mission was to represent Palestinians living under occupation in strategic litigation against companies before foreign courts to seek remedy for their complicity in violations of international law, for instance, the pillage of natural resources in the occupied territories, or the transfer of civilians into Israeli settlements. And that felt like a really promising angle where international justice could have a say because these companies were based in countries, for instance, here in Europe, where international law was the law of the land and taken seriously, unlike the kind of results we would expect in Israeli courts. And yet companies registered here in Europe were flouting the law and making a profit off of war crimes in occupied territory. So I spent about 5 years setting up Global Echo from the ground up, building up a team and leading its flagship cases. And that's when I encountered an opportunity to do much the same work, but on a global scale at Amnesty. I didn't know it as a law student, but Amnesty had started a pioneering initiative right around the time of my studies known as the Corporate Crimes Project that was sort of laying the foundation for a fledgling field of legal practitioners and civil society and law enforcement trying to hold accountable companies and corporate actors criminally for violating the law linked to human rights abuses. And I got involved in that network. And eventually Amnesty invited me to join and lead that project globally. I can also give you a little bit of a sense of the work that I do on the business and human rights team, if that would help.
Yeah, please.
Since joining the team, so I'm a legal advisor and researcher on Amnesty's business and human rights team. And so part of my work is, related to what I just mentioned, which is managing that corporate crimes project, where essentially I support a network of dozens of NGOs from around the world developing corporate crimes cases. We do that in a bunch of different ways. We organize regular calls, annual convenings where we bring everybody together and workshop cases. We publish resources to help guide and build the capacity of practitioners. So recently we published this corporate crimes handbook. We recently launched at the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights in Geneva. Hopefully listeners will be able to have a link available to them and they'll be able to take a look. But it's essentially a guide for practitioners trying to bring these kinds of cases. It's sort of the handbook that I wish I had on my desk when I first started doing this work. And it's based on lessons learned from nearly a dozen cases, the Lafarge case in France, the Lundin case in Sweden, the Ford case in Argentina, the Chiquita case in Colombia, and others. And also we do, at Amnesty, I do my own research and support work on corporate crimes. Sometimes we directly intervene in cases. So, for example, I led Amnesty's filing of an amicus brief in the La Fronterita case in Argentina, where corporate executives were charged with complicity in crimes against humanity, of torture and enforced disappearances committed by the Argentinian dictatorship decades ago now. So that's a big part of my work. In addition to that, I also provide legal advice to the Amnesty movement on pretty much everything, business and human rights, all sort of international laws applied to corporate actors. So pretty much everything that Amnesty puts out that addresses corporate human rights abuses, either I or my colleague has reviewed. So it definitely keeps us busy and is profoundly rewarding and meaningful work.
It sounds like that. I'm listening to you there and thinking, wow, it must be fascinating as well. And a lot of work, I suppose a lot crosses your desk, so to speak, but all very interesting and all very relevant stuff. Now, we have, as I mentioned, spoken about this area loosely on the podcast with various guests. We've spoken about the Occupied Territories Bill a lot because we're based in Ireland. So this kind of plays in a little bit to that kind of global and European aspect of your work and holding corporations and countries, of course, accountable when it comes to this kind of corporate criminal liability, which we don't touch on as much. And in general, when we speak about conflicts, conversation tends to focus on human rights abuses, in terms of state responsibility. But in respect of conflicts, how should we or how do we approach the issue of corporate criminal responsibility in a practical sense? How do you start your work? What should we be looking at if we wanted to have a conversation around this piece?
It's a really good question. And yeah, it makes a lot of sense that we focus on states because, at the end of the day, states' militaries are the ones that wage wars. And historically, international law has focused on states as sort of the primary actors that are responsible for violations of the law. But today, that picture has changed. So private actors, there's armed groups, but also there's companies that are deeply embedded in conflict today. So whether it's by providing satellite communications like Starlink that enables battlefield connectivity in Ukraine, or arms manufacturers that are supplying the sort of munitions that are used in war, or extractives companies that are operating in conflict zone to exploit natural resources amidst a conflict. Essentially, the way to think about all this is that they're subject to the law as anyone else would be. So when a company operates in connection with an armed conflict or with a war, then the laws of war apply to their operations and to their staff. And international criminal law recognizes that individuals, including corporate executives, can be responsible for war crimes if they aid and abet their commission. There's also a broad consensus that companies have a responsibility to respect human rights, even in conflict areas, and in fact, especially in conflict areas, given the increased risk of those abuses, and must conduct heightened human rights due diligence to ensure they aren't driving the conflict or contributing to abuses. So let's just say that doing business in a conflict zone is incredibly precarious. And I recommend, if there's any companies listening, that they, direct their legal team to conduct a thorough review and proceed with the utmost caution, because there's a lot of international law regulations that they have to be aware of. The challenge, of course, is enforcement. And that's where the rubber meets the road. In terms of international criminal law, prosecutors often lack resources, jurisdiction, in many cases, kind of political will to pursue these cases. And that's where civil society comes in. That's where NGOs like Amnesty and many others in our network do really incredible investigative work. We document abuses, we trace corporate links, we develop case files that can encourage law enforcement actors to open criminal investigations. And yeah, that's sort of the value we try to add in this work.
So it's really striking that balance there. But I find that really interesting that the enforcement piece, is the problem there. And even if you do, I don't know, identify, a supply chain issue there or something, it's hard to kind of combat that. And so, as you say, right, there's the NGOs and kind of a lobbying body there as well to kind of draw attention to that. But is there good guidance there in the first place? How can a company ensure if they are, playing the game and doing everything correctly? Is there good guidance there? Is this issue becoming more of a live issue as time goes on? What can they look at to make sure that they are complicit?
There's a ton of guidance out there, and there's entire organizations that their job is really to provide those kinds of resources to companies and to corporate actors. There's consultancies that are wrapped around that. There's law firms that now do this kind of work. There's the UN puts out these guides. I think there's recently in the past couple of years, the UN put out a guide about what heightened human rights due diligence really means when businesses operate in conflict zones. So I often find that companies say that they may not be aware of what they're supposed to do, but really, I mean, these are incredibly well-resourced organizations. They've got an army of lawyers, and I think that they've got plenty of resources to help them figure it out. So at least we at Amnesty, our role, the way we see it, is less to provide companies guidance. We're more providing sort of the practitioners and law enforcement with guidance, and then kind of exposing what companies are doing in their involvement in human rights abuses and trying to put some pressure on them, both in the court of public opinion and hopefully in courts of law as well.
Brilliant. So there really is no excuse with that wealth of information that's out there. But maybe just drilling into the work a little bit more, can you maybe give us an example of your work? I know you mentioned the Global Echo Litigation Centre there, and you spent time there in the NGO that you found with your colleagues. But I know you did a lot of work in the occupied territories as well. And I'm just wondering, can you maybe give us an example of some of your work where you've seen this in practice, and what kind of lessons did you learn from it?
Yeah, definitely. Would be more than happy to. Before I jump into the Global Echo case in particular, maybe I'll back up a little bit and just give a sense of what really kind of the objective or how you really think about investigating corporate crimes. From my perspective, the key to doing those kinds of investigations is to collect what's called linkage evidence, which is evidence that links the crimes happening on the ground to perpetrators who, in a company's case, maybe executives that are sitting in a boardroom thousands of miles away. In terms of how you do that, well, you can and you should speak to affected communities on the ground, and they can tell you what they've experienced as a result of abuses committed in wartime and what remedy they're seeking. That's certainly what we did at Global Echo. It had close connections with Palestinian communities that we represented, and that's incredibly important. And so Amnesty's handbook recommends that sort of close engagement as part of a community-centered process. But community members may not know exactly what's going on behind all the bullets and the bombs, that there are actually countless companies that are providing goods and service that enable sort of the military attacks and the attacks on civilians. And they can't really get into the minds of the corporate executives in those boardrooms. So that's sort of the objective of a corporate crimes investigation is to try to uncover that. So in terms of how we did that, I could give an example of a case that I investigated for a number of years involving a concrete company operating in the occupied West Bank. The case used to not be part of the public record, so it's not very well known, but our clients at the time, a Palestinian human rights organization called Al-Haq, discussed the case and named the company publicly, so I feel comfortable talking about it and doing the same. So the case concerned the operations of a German company named Heidelberg Cement. I think they've now rebranded as Heidelberg Materials. They have an Israeli subsidiary that operated a quarry in the West Bank where they extracted rock from occupied territory, and they used that kind of rock and stone to manufacture various products, including concrete. And the quarry's operations have been well documented by human rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch and Al-Haq, over the years. But Heidelberg had always denied that they then sold that concrete to customers in Israeli settlements. And we made it our mission to prove otherwise with hard evidence. So the way that we investigated that case is we started out just by kind of closely watching their facilities in occupied territory from sort of public access roads. And we started noticing that cement trucks would leave their facilities and make deliveries to customers. So we started following the trucks. And over 2 years, I mean, I must have followed hundreds of trucks myself, and began establishing sort of a pattern of deliveries from company facilities to construction sites in Israeli settlements all over the West Bank. So we documented everything. We had the trucks leaving the facility, the deliveries to the settlements, dates, quantities, the buildings that were constructed. And so I remember even one day I noticed the company had discarded a set of binders in the trash. And so I went through the garbage, literally rummaged through it, and discovered a trove of internal documents. And so we preserved them properly to establish chain of custody so they could be admissible in court, and found that they documented years of settlement deliveries far before that we'd been following that activity. The problem is that was incredibly valuable evidence, but it was really only half the puzzle. We then needed to figure out not only what was happening on the ground, but then how to link it to senior executives in Germany. So we partnered with a German organization of ethical shareholders who essentially they buy some symbolic shares in a company and they engage with that company. And they've been doing that with Heidelberg for a number of years to try to encourage them to be more human rights respecting. And they raised the evidence that we'd collected directly with senior management. And in the course of those conversations, the executives made incredible admissions. I mean, they confirmed their knowledge of the settlement deliveries and their control over the subsidiary responsible for them. And we had it all on record. So that was sort of the final piece of that puzzle. And that investigation, which I think took about 2 years, if not more, resulted in a 200-page criminal complaint that we filed with the German Federal Prosecutor's War Crimes Unit. As far as I know, a formal investigation by that unit still hasn't been opened. But the key lesson that I take away from that case is that civil society can play a crucial role in corporate crimes investigations. With some creativity and persistence, NGOs can uncover that linkage evidence needed to connect the abuses on the ground to, decision makers in the boardrooms. And, shortly after our evidence surfaced, the company shut down its facilities in occupied territories and deliveries to settlements ground to a near halt. So from a human rights perspective, that kind of impact on the ground is already meaningful, even if we haven't managed to hold the company accountable before a court of law. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense of how to approach these kinds of investigations.
It does. And that was going to be just my next question there. I'm eagerly waiting to find out, what can somebody do if we have, say in Ireland, for example, if we suspect a company's involved or complicit in some form. Let's give Palestine, Israel as an example there, because we know about this. And I know the Occupied Territories Bill is a very live discussion at the moment. But is there a reporting mechanism as such? So even if you have a suspicion, if you haven't been able to investigate it yourself, or, are there law firms in Ireland or in the UK that you could go to first that can do that investigative piece, and then do they link in with the NGO? What's a practical kind of way to just start that whole process?
It's a very good question, and this is exactly why we wrote the Corporate Crimes Handbook. So I'd recommend people take a look at that. Yes. It's essentially meant to be a resource for folks who are just kind of gotten interested in this space and are trying to figure out, how can I even get involved? And my recommendation, there's definitely folks that you could, report to, and it really depends on your jurisdiction. So I don't know as much about the UK and Ireland. I do know that there are incredible law firms and organizations that are doing work in this space, in those jurisdictions. So I recommend getting in touch with them and speaking with an expert. But once you've gotten some sort of legal advice, and many folks will do this pro bono, you can also more than welcome to reach out to me. You can find me on LinkedIn. And one of the roles that we have is we support folks in trying to get this sort of information in the right hands. But that's when we would start thinking about, okay, what do we really have in our hands? Yeah. Is this really rise to the level of criminal accountability? Is this more of kind of something for civil litigation? Or is this more of just, let's just expose it, put it in a big report, try to get media attention to it, and try to hold them accountable in sort of the court of public opinion? And that may depend on exactly what you have on your hands, but I think it'd be good to take a look at that handbook and reach out to folks that are working in the space, and we can guide you in what to do with it.
That handbook's brilliant. We will share links to that, and I certainly know of people who'll be wanting to get their hands on that. And I will say we have had the ICJP and GLAN also on the podcast who have been actively involved in this type of work as well. So there are people out there that you can report to and learn about this, and especially looking at Amnesty's work on the field in particular. But just let's get to after the investigative piece, and we're moving on to prosecution. How does that work in practice in terms of who do you work with? What's it like working with prosecutors? Have you gotten to that level yet? And how do you actually prepare these files?
Yeah, this is an essential question, and it gets at a key lesson that we at Amnesty highlight in our handbook, which is that corporate accountability is most likely when affected communities, civil society practitioners, and law enforcement are able to cooperate, and engagement with prosecutors, investigators, judges. Listen, it's challenging and it's not always appropriate. There needs to be respect for their independence as judicial actors and our independence as civil society. There may be risks to engaging with them, or you may know already that they're adversarial. But in most jurisdictions, you need law enforcement officials to formally initiate the investigation and prosecution of corporate crimes. And granted, in the UK, I don't know about Ireland, there is a possibility for private prosecutions, but it's been hemmed in considerably. So essentially, if you want to encourage the prosecution of corporate crimes, a major lesson learned from nearly all of the cases that we reviewed in our handbook was that a cooperative relationship with law enforcement proved invaluable to advancing that case. And that's sort of part and parcel of what we do at Amnesty as part of the Corporate Crimes Project. We bring civil society and law enforcement practitioners together. And these are two groups that, are not natural partners. In fact, there tends to be a lot of mistrust, which makes sense. In many ways, Amnesty is quite critical of law enforcement and holds the state to account when it's involved in human rights abuses. But in this particular context, there's also opportunities for cooperation. And so we organize these convenings and bring folks together to great effect. I can't share all the details because these relationships are sensitive, but I'll give some examples. So in one case, civil society practitioners reported that their kind of connections with law enforcement authorities were crucial to reaching an indictment in a corporate crimes case, because that allowed them to sort of exchange views on doctrinal matters, on the law, and enabled coordination of evidence collection and sort of a candid discussion about how the case can overcome challenges along the way. And in another case, a practitioner was able to establish a trusting relationship with a police officer who filed an internal report obliging the prosecutors in that jurisdiction to proceed with an investigation, which some of them had considered discontinuing. So it's important that when we engage with law enforcement, though, that civil society doesn't overstep and become sort of an agent of law enforcement. So that's also something to be careful about. That's not only problematic ethically, but there's some legal repercussions as well. So it's important to maintain independence, because there may come a time also when law enforcement need to have pressure brought to bear against them. If civil society provides law enforcement with evidence that we think meets their threshold to open a criminal investigation, and a reasonable time has passed and that investigation isn't opened, well, it's time to stop being cooperative. And it's really time to start holding these prosecutors' feet to the fire. And the options vary by jurisdiction, but that can range from requesting judicial review of a prosecutor's decision to launching a media campaign to demonstrate public interest in the case. So there's a bunch of different options there.
Yeah, I think that's so important to remember the criminal aspect, then there's the civil aspect, but then there's that kind of expose piece as well that can be equally as important. But really sound advice there, and very, very important for anybody, even contemplating not even working in this area, but really getting involved in groups that are perhaps participating in it. And I'm just wondering as well, aside from that, how much of your work maybe involves supporting maybe smaller Amnesty International offices or smaller NGOs, or indeed political groups as such, who are maybe pressurising their governments to cease this type of trade, or to call out companies within their jurisdiction that are trading, whether it's in goods or services. Is that part and parcel of what you do, or how far does that extend?
Definitely. We've got Amnesty is a huge movement. We've got kind of chapters in many, many countries around the world, some smaller, some larger. but many of them are interested in business and human rights issues because they see what companies are involved in their in the countries where they're based. It's not always conflict, although that's certainly a major issue, but it could be companies involved in massive environmental harm and pollution. It could be companies involved in displacing indigenous peoples from their land. There's all sorts of financial corruption, in terms of companies involved with state authorities and kind of shady deals there. So this issue kind of runs the gamut. It's incredibly broad, and there's a ton of interest, both from kind of our chapters around the world and from, smaller organizations that are based in these countries. And it looks different depending on what region you're based in. I know there's a lot of work on this in Latin America in particular, for instance. So we do our best to support so much of this work that's being done all over the world, and there's only a small handful of us. But we do our best to support as much as possible. And that's why it's also great to join some of our networks, because in that way, you're not only able to, access support by Amnesty directly, but also by other organizations in the space, and sort of working in community in that way is incredibly valuable, because you can't really take on a big company like this all on your own. They're too powerful for that. You've got to work in partnership and collaborate.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, it seems to be a very much this business and human rights area of law seems to be very much, it's vast, as you've just explained, but it's emerging, I think. And we do hear a lot of maybe younger students talking about it as an interest area, which is really good. So Roy, a lot of the lawyers that come on the podcast talk about, the work that they have in front of them, that it's very challenging. And yours must be challenging in the sense that there's a lot to contemplate, a lot to consider. How do you navigate those challenges? And this is sometimes a stupid question, but is there a work-life balance that exists?
It's a really good question. And work-life balance and human rights work is not always, those two things don't always go together. But in general, human rights work, is incredibly challenging. The cards are stacked against you. The work can feel endless, stressful, generally not always the most well paid. And of course, the human rights abuses themselves are horrific and can lead to kind of vicarious trauma. So you have to be kind of a certain kind of person to be able to withstand work in a field like this. And you need kind of a really good reason to enter the field. So one of the things I often tell folks who are getting into it is to write themselves a letter. And then when you have moments of doubt, you can kind of remember the why you got into it in the first place. Yeah, it really helped me when I went through a round of burnout toward the end of my time at Global Echo. I had poured my blood, sweat, and tears into that organization. And yet I looked at the world around us and kind of felt like everything was falling apart. Yeah. And in those moments, it's easy to become despondent and feel like the human rights movement is on the retreat and people are literally dying. And that's precisely when burnout hits. And for many years, I was able to stave off burnout because I'd held on to that hope, whether it's hope that our cases would have impact or that our clients would find justice. And that was sort of the reason that I got into this work, and I believed in it. But it allowed me to withstand tremendous stress. But it was when I lost that hope that burnout started creeping in, and suddenly everything became a challenge. Even just getting out of bed, let alone investigating corporate crime. So the way that I dealt with that, and what I recommend to anyone out there who wants to get into this work, and this is something we all struggle with, is to just take a step back and give your body and mind a break for a while, and to find support. This is why I believe that working in community is really important, not only kind of with others in our field of human rights, but with affected communities, because that human connection is often what gets us through all of this. And so again, please feel free to reach out to me, whether on LinkedIn, et cetera. Happy to support one another. But the other kind of piece of practical advice that I'd give is that, one way to hold on to hope that I found is by redefining what success looks like in our work. It doesn't always have to mean winning in the courtroom. That's incredibly difficult to do and is not always in our control. Yeah. And success can really mean a variety of things. It could mean changing a company's behavior. It could mean exposing a truth, of giving communities a sense that their experiences have been heard. And it's also important to kind of understand that there's a long road to change. So don't kind of let your setbacks feel like failures. you can kind of get back up, dust yourself off, re-strategize, and remember that, a small group of thoughtful, committed people can change the world, as Margaret Mead said, and to kind of remember the why of why you got into this work in the first place.
Wow. So true. And thank you for sharing that. And that's really important to be mindful of that when you're entering into this field, and to share that kind of practical advice and your own experience as well is, truly impactful. So thank you for sharing that, Roi. What advice would you have for anybody who's listening now that thinks, wow, I'd like to get involved in this kind of corporate accountability work? What practical advice might you have? And, what challenges might they face if they're trying to navigate this really interesting field of law?
Yeah, it is a really interesting field. It's relatively, it's not that it's new, but it's evolved significantly in the past decade or so. And I'd encourage folks listening to this to explore a little bit and see whether they want to be involved in the field. In terms of practical advice, the first is just to be persistent. This is a challenging field to break into. Human rights in general, there's a lot of demands for jobs in this work, and there tends to be less supply, especially for entry-level roles. So you need to find a way to get your foot in the door, and that may not always be with your dream job. Perhaps you'll have to work your way up to it. Careers in this field rarely follow a straight path. So if you'll recall, I mentioned that actually my dream was to become an international prosecutor, and I haven't quite done that yet. I haven't fulfilled that dream, but I work in sort of, you could say, the shadow of a prosecutor's. Corporate crimes work is sort of prosecution adjacent. We support prosecutors. So finding a role where you can contribute to the field. It doesn't have to be as a lawyer. It could be as a researcher. It could be as a journalist, a campaigner. It might even be relevant to work for the private sector, for a law firm. It's helpful to have folks who understand the sort of internal workings from a company's perspective, and then they come and join us and try to hold companies accountable. So I think that is really valuable experience. And then as you're doing that, sort of cultivating your networks, staying engaged with the field, and then you sort of leverage where you've started to try to get to where you want to go, and that requires persistence. I think the second point we already mentioned is kind of collaborating with others and cultivating your networks. It's incredibly important. And lastly, I'd really recommend people build investigative skills. There are a lot of lawyers in this field that can weave clever arguments, some compelling and others less so, but at the end of the day, we're stuck with the facts that we have. And what we don't get taught in law school is that good facts tend to make good law. And so we need to find those facts. And nobody taught me how to do that. I had to teach myself how to investigate. But today there's plenty of resources out there, from the handbook that has a whole chapter on investigations to there's a bunch of OSINT, open source intelligence collection classes out there, the high-level criminal investigation courses. And there's a ton of free material on YouTube and elsewhere. And so a talented investigator will always have a job, because super valuable skill.
That's so interesting. You've just put me in mind of a recording we did with a solicitor called Roman Shortall, and that would be very relevant to your type of work, because he's an investigative journalist and also a lawyer, and he's also investigating this corporate accountability issue as well, among others. But he had mentioned that too, that if colleges and universities and third level institutes ran this, merging these two kind of areas together in some capacity, it would be really beneficial for people working particularly in international law arenas as well. So that investigative piece there is crucial. As you say, I'm very interested there that you brought that up. So fantastic advice there for anybody interested in this line of work. But how can listeners follow your work, Roi, and what you're doing, and how can maybe they get involved and just keep up to speed with everything that's happening and support your work?
Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to invite sort of all the listeners in. First of all, I'd invite them to read the Corporate Crimes Handbook and to follow the work of the Business and Human Rights team. I can share kind of the links with you about our social media feed so they can follow our work there. They're also welcome to find me on LinkedIn and reach out to me. The human rights movement is sort of, it's a small world. So I'm more than happy to connect with fellow travelers and colleagues to be. And most importantly, I'd say, the main way that we support one another is that we live our values and we infuse them into our work in a meaningful way. We never know what we can achieve when we kind of reject these social norms of, trying to make the most money or having the most status, but instead aim for having the most meaning by bringing justice to others. And if more of us choose kind of work that brings meaning and justice to the world, even in small ways, and we cooperate and try to support one another in making that happen, that's that's how real change comes to fruition. So, I mean, that's what keeps me going, at least, and that's what I'd encourage your listeners to do.
Wonderful. Look, Roi, thank you so much for joining us today. That is really invaluable. A fantastic conversation that I'm delighted to be able to share with our listeners and a broader audience as well. And yeah, I wish you the best with everything, and let's stay in touch. And as mentioned, we'll share the links to Roi's work on the show notes to this episode. And yeah, best of luck with everything.
Fantastic. Thanks again for having me, and looking forward to seeing the episode come out.
Thanks everyone for joining me today. If you like the show, please remember to share and leave a review if you have a moment. And you can also check out our website, www.activistlawyer.com, where you will see some blog articles written by our guests and contributors, as well as some fabulous Activist Lawyer merchandise.
This podcast was recorded in Granite Podcast Studio. Interested in starting up your own podcast but don't know how? Granite Podcast Studio can help. Record your podcast in our state-of-the-art studio, which is based in the heart of Newry City. Our studio has cutting-edge and user-friendly technology and can seat up to 4 people. We also provide an editing service for our team, using your guidance and editing notes to provide you with a flawless finished product, leaving your listeners wanting more. For more information on how you can get started, visit www.granitepodcaststudio.com.